The night stretched long and silent, as if the world itself had forgotten how to breathe. The wind whistled through the desolate streets, carrying the scent of damp concrete and distant rain. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a passing car echoed against the hollow alley walls. And then, a sound. Faint. Desperate. A whimper, barely louder than the rustling of discarded newspapers scattered across the pavement. Beneath the flickering glow of a lone streetlight, nestled between two rusted dumpsters, lay a tiny, trembling figure. A puppy. Alone. Too weak to move. Too cold to cry any louder. His body was curled into itself, his fur, once golden and soft, now matted with dirt, streaked with mud. His ribs pressed sharply against his fragile skin, his legs limp, motionless. 4 hours, perhaps days, he had been here. Waiting. Hoping. But no one had come. The hunger in his belly was no longer sharp, just a dull ache, one he had grown used to. His throat was parched, his tiny breath shallow. Was this how it ended? Would he close his eyes for the last time, right here, in the shadows where no one would ever find him? Or was there still a sliver of hope left in this world? Somewhere out there, was there someone who cared? The night dragged on. The wind howled. The puppy's breathing slowed. His tiny heart pounded, weak and uneven. He tried to lift his head, just a little, tried to move, to find warmth, to crawl out of the darkness. But his legs refused. His body had given up before his spirit had. He had not always known this kind of loneliness. There was a time, a distant, hazy memory, when he had warmth. He remembered soft voices. A gentle touch. A mother's warmth, a sibling's playful nudge. But those memories felt like dreams now, fading into nothing. And now, here he was. Alone. Unwanted. Discarded like garbage. Headlights. A soft glow in the distance. A car rolling down the street, its tires splashing through shallow puddles left behind by the storm. Inside the car, Sophie sat behind the wheel, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. She was exhausted. It had been a long day at the animal shelter, long hours spent scrubbing floors, tending to sick animals, filling food bowls for the countless strays that came through the doors. She had been doing this work for years. And yet, no matter how many animals she saved, there were always more. More abandoned souls. More stories of cruelty. More helpless creatures left behind by the world. She sighed, her eyes drifting toward the road ahead. And that was when she saw it. A small, motionless shape. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Her foot pressed the brake. For a second, she just sat there, staring through the windshield. A lump of old rags? A shadow? No. A puppy. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned on her hazard lights and threw the car into park. In an instant, she was out in the cold, the wind biting at her skin as she rushed toward the tiny figure on the ground. Kneeling down, Sophie's heart clenched at the sight before her. The puppy was barely breathing. His tiny chest rose and fell in slow, painful movements. His fur was damp, tangled with filth, his tiny paws curled against his frail body as if trying to hold on to whatever warmth was left. He did not move when she reached out. He did not flinch, did not resist. He was too weak to be afraid. Sophie swallowed hard, blinking back the sting of tears. She had seen suffering before, but this? This was different. This was hopelessness. She touched his side gently, her fingers brushing against his fragile ribs. "You are okay," she whispered, though she was not sure if it was true. She could feel his heartbeat. Weak. Unsteady. Fading. Her breath hitched. No. Not tonight. Not like this. She would not let him slip away. Carefully, she unzipped her jacket, wrapping it around his tiny body. His head lolled slightly as she lifted him, his weight barely noticeable in her arms. Too light. Too fragile. Sophie cradled him close to her chest, her pulse racing. "You are safe now," she whispered. And for the first time in his short, painful life, the little puppy was held by hands that would never let him go. Sophie moved fast. The puppy was too cold, too weak. He needed warmth, food, help. She slid back into the driver's seat, placing the tiny bundle in her lap, keeping him wrapped in her jacket as she turned the heat on full blast. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, dialing the number she knew by heart. "Dr. Mason," she said the moment the line picked up. "I need your help." The veterinarian's voice was groggy. "Sophie. I found a puppy. He is in bad shape. He is barely breathing." A pause. Then, "Bring him in. Now." Sophie ended the call and pressed her foot against the gas pedal. The streetlights blurred past her. The little body in her lap barely moved. She could feel his weak breaths against her arm, each one lighter than the last. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice shaking. He was so small, so helpless, so close to slipping away. But she had found him, and she would fight for him, even if he was too weak to fight for himself. Would he survive? Would he ever learn to trust again, to walk, to run, to live? Or was Sophie already too late? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. This little puppy was no longer alone. Because in a world that had abandoned him, he had finally found hope. This is only the beginning of his journey. If you believe in the power of kindness, stay with me until the end of this story. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who refuses to look away. Sophie's car sped through the empty streets, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The tiny, fragile puppy lay wrapped in her jacket on the passenger seat, his body eerily still. She kept glancing over, her heart pounding. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice shaking. The street lights flashed past in a blur. The shelter's veterinary clinic was just a few miles away, but every second felt like an eternity. The puppy did not move. His small, weak breaths were barely visible beneath the folds of the jacket. Sophie swallowed back panic. She had rescued sick animals before, but this one was different. There was something about the way he had looked at her, even in his weakest state. Something that begged, "Do not leave me." She would not. The clinic doors swung open as Sophie rushed inside, cradling the puppy in her arms. The scent of antiseptic and fresh linen filled the air, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Dr. Mason, the shelter's head veterinarian, was already waiting. He took one look at Sophie's expression, then at the bundle in her arms, and his face darkened. "Put him here," he instructed, gesturing to the exam table. Sophie gently placed the puppy down. He did not even whimper. Dr. Mason immediately went to work, his gloved hands moving fast, checking the puppy's temperature, listening to his heartbeat, feeling his frail limbs. Sophie stood frozen, biting her lip. "He is in critical condition," Dr. Mason murmured. "Severely malnourished, hypothermic, dehydrated." Sophie swallowed hard. "Can we save him?" Dr. Mason hesitated. "He has a fighting chance, if he makes it through the night." The weight of those words settled deep in Sophie's chest. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the puppy's damp fur. "You can do this," she whispered. But would he? Would he keep fighting? Or was it already too late? Hours passed. Sophie refused to leave. She sat by the puppy's crate in the quiet recovery room, watching his small body rise and fall with shallow breaths. He had been given fluids, warmed blankets, tiny drops of formula, but he had not woken up. Sophie's fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. "Come on, little guy," she whispered. "I know you are tired, but you have to keep fighting." The clinic was silent except for the soft beeping of machines. Then, a twitch. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement of his paw. Sophie's breath caught. She leaned in closer. And then, for the first time, the puppy's eyes flickered open. Dark, glassy, but alive. Tears stung her eyes. "Hey there," she murmured. "You are awake." The puppy barely moved, his tiny body still weak, but his eyes stayed locked onto hers. As if he recognized her. As if he knew she had saved him. Sophie smiled through the lump in her throat. "You are a fighter," she whispered. And just like that, he had a name. Fighter. Fighter was alive. But his battle had only just begun. His legs were too weak to support him. His muscles had wasted away from hunger. The first time Sophie placed a bowl of soft food in front of him, he just stared at it. His body wanted it. But his mind, his past, told him to be afraid. Had food been used against him before? Had he been starved as punishment? Sophie's heart ached as she dipped a finger into the food, holding it near his mouth. "Try," she whispered. For a moment, Fighter hesitated. Then, his tongue flicked out. A tiny lick. A small taste. Sophie's heart soared. "That is it," she encouraged, tears threatening to spill. The journey would be slow, but it had begun. Days turned into weeks. Every day, Fighter grew a little stronger. The first time he stood up on his own, his legs wobbled like a newborn fawn's. He nearly collapsed, but Sophie was there, her hand steady beneath him. The first time he wagged his tail, it was barely a flicker. But it was there. And the first time he let out a tiny, hesitant bark. Sophie laughed, tears spilling down her face. He was coming back to life. But healing was not just physical. Fighter still carried invisible scars. The first time someone raised their voice in the shelter, just a loud laugh, an excited shout, he dropped to the ground, trembling. Sophie knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "You are safe." The first time she reached for him too quickly, he flinched. She swallowed hard, her chest tightening. Who had hurt him? What had he endured before she found him? The questions haunted her. But she knew one thing. She would never let anyone hurt him again. 3 months after she found him, Sophie took Fighter to the park. A wide, open field stretched before them. Green grass, blue skies, the warmth of the sun on their skin. Fighter sat beside her, his head tilted as he took in the world around him. Sophie unhooked his leash. He had never been free before. "You can run," she whispered. Fighter hesitated. His paws shifted. His ears twitched. Then, a breeze ruffled his fur. His body tensed. And he moved. Slowly at first. Then faster. His legs, once too weak to hold him, carried him forward. His tail wagged, not out of fear, but out of joy. Sophie watched, tears streaming down her face. He was not just surviving anymore. He was living. Fighter was finally ready for adoption. The shelter had found a family willing to take him in. But the night before his adoption, Sophie sat beside him in her small apartment, her fingers brushing through his soft fur. Her heart ached. She had saved him. But could she let him go? Fighter lifted his head, looking up at her with deep, trusting eyes. And in that moment, she knew. She was not giving him a home. She was his home. Sophie let out a breathless laugh, hugging him close. "You are staying with me." Fighter licked her cheek, his tail wagging. Not out of fear. Not out of hesitation. But out of love. Fighter was too weak to walk. But he never stopped fighting. And in the end, he won. Because love saved him. And love? It made him unstoppable. Would you have made the same decision? Let me know in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, a quick like helps more people see it. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who refuses to look away. The night before Fighter's adoption, Sophie lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her heart felt heavy. The shelter had found him a family. A couple who had fallen in love with his story, with his resilience. A couple who promised to love him. It should have felt like a victory. But it did not. Sophie turned her head toward the small bed at the foot of hers. Fighter lay curled up, his little body rising and falling in deep, steady breaths. Safe. Warm. Home. Something deep in Sophie's chest ached. She had saved him. She had watched him take his first wobbly steps, had seen him grow stronger, had whispered encouragement into his fur when he was too weak to move. Could she really say goodbye? Would he understand? Would he think she was abandoning him? Just like the world had before? Her throat tightened. She rolled onto her side, reaching out a hand. "Fighter," she whispered. His ears twitched, but he did not wake. Sophie sighed, her fingers gripping the blanket. She had always known this was the goal. Rescue. Rehabilitate. Find a home. But what if? What if she was his home? The next morning, Sophie stood outside the shelter, her hands buried in the pockets of her sweater. Fighter sat beside her, his tail giving a slow, uncertain wag. He could sense something was different. Inside, the couple was waiting. The people who would take him away. Fighter leaned against Sophie's leg, pressing his small body into her warmth. Her heart clenched. The shelter door opened. A kind-looking woman stepped outside, smiling warmly. "Sophie, they are ready to meet Fighter." Sophie swallowed hard, looking down at the dog who had once been too weak to lift his head. The dog who had fought against all odds. The dog who had found her. He looked up at her, dark eyes filled with trust. And in that moment, she knew. She could not do it. She knelt down, cupping his small face in her hands. "Fighter," she whispered. "Do you want to stay with me?" For a second, there was silence. Then, his tail wagged. Not hesitantly, not uncertainly, but wildly, joyfully. Sophie laughed, tears slipping down her cheeks. She looked up at the woman from the shelter, her voice trembling. "I cannot give him up." The woman's eyes softened. "I had a feeling you would say that." Sophie let out a watery laugh, pressing a kiss to Fighter's forehead. She was not giving him a home. She had been his home all along. Bringing Fighter home, really home, was different this time. There was no uncertainty, no fear of the unknown, only the warmth of belonging. Fighter ran through the house like he had always belonged there. Because he had. Sophie watched him, her chest swelling with something too big to name. Love. Joy. Forever. She knelt down as he came bounding toward her, his tail wagging so hard his whole body wiggled. She caught him in her arms, laughing. "You were always meant to stay," she whispered. Fighter licked her cheek, as if to say, "I know." Months passed, and Fighter blossomed. His once frail body was strong now. His once hesitant steps were filled with confidence. He no longer flinched at sudden movements. He no longer curled into himself in fear. But there was one final test. One final moment that would show just how far he had come. One afternoon, as Sophie took Fighter for a walk, a car slowed as it passed. A dark-colored car. The same kind of car that had abandoned him. Fighter froze. His ears flattened. His tail tucked. Sophie felt her breath catch. Would he panic? Would the old fear come rushing back? For a moment, he did not move. Then, he turned, looked up at her, and wagged his tail. Not out of submission, not out of fear, but out of trust. Sophie exhaled, dropping to her knees and wrapping him in her arms. "You are free now," she whispered. And he was. Free from his past. Free from the pain. Free to love. Free to live. Fighter's story could have ended in that alley. He could have been another forgotten soul. Another life discarded. But he was not. Because someone stopped. Because someone cared. Because someone chose to fight for him. And now, he was happy. He was loved. He was home. Fighter was too weak to walk. But he never stopped fighting. And in the end, he won. Because love saved him. And love? It made him unstoppable. Have you ever rescued an animal? Have you ever seen a life change because of kindness? Share your story in the comments below. Your words can inspire someone today. And if this story touched your heart, a quick like helps more people see it. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who refuses to look away. This is just one of many stories of resilience, love, and second chances. Subscribe to be part of a community that believes in hope. Because together, we can change the world, one act of kindness at a time.